No, I wouldn't be so sure, Natalia. I thank you for your kind words, because concluding this sort of seminar that Riccardo has envisaged is not so easy, because we have several disciplines with their own different histories, with their own different impacts. And not even Leonardo could successfully conclude a seminar like this one. I could do it by going to the discipline I'm most familiar with, but instead of this, as president of the Treccani Institute, I can tell you that one of the main works we are preparing for the future is precisely the contribution of Italians to the developments of thought, we say in Italiano, pensiero, and therefore the several volumes of this work will touch upon the issues that were discussed today. So which kind of contribution Italian economists, Italian philosophers, Italian legal scholars, Italian politologists have been giving to the history and the developments of thought in the world, which is not an easy work, very much controversial, because the first reaction of my scientists was, we are borderless. It doesn't mean anything to us if you say Italians. What Italians means for science. Italians are part of a wider community of science, and therefore, well, I said, there are things such as the Nobel Prize that goes to an Italian, very rarely, an American, much more frequently, etc. So there might be reasons that we might be interested in understanding. But I'm not going into this because, let's say, accepting the kind of challenge that was coming from the last beautiful report by Bruni on civil things, and going to the celebrations of our national unity, I will try to understand, let's say, the contribution that humanities and human sciences gave and have been giving to the process of unification and the Italy that we got out of that process, which is something that is opened up by that kind of civil sciences, civil economy it was, and it's now declining toward a sort of nothing that is spoiling us of the intangibles of a democratic system, of those, let's say, intangible, those principles, values that are somehow presupposed by any democratic system, but according to the well-known dilemma by Bekenford, they can't be provided for by law. They have to exist. They come from culture. They come from science. And they did come at the time. We know that it's very usual for historians beginning their conversations on the unification of Italy to say that Italy existed as a cultural entity much before a state, the Kingdom of Italy, was formed, which is quite true. there was a culture, and it also was an open culture. This is something extremely important, extremely important. We had the language, we had our arts, we had our cultural heritage. And it was a heritage that had been formed by putting diversities together. So it was not the heritage of the ethnic group that you may call the Italians. First of all, because the Italians were not an ethnic group, were the historical synthesis of several ethnic groups that had come into that part of the European territory that enters into the Mediterranean before the Romans and after the Romans. So there were Latins, there were Sanniti, Volsci, several others, Etrusci, and after them Goths, Ostrogoths, Franks, Longobards, Celts, all of these people became Italians. They settled, they brought their culture, they mixed their cultures, they mixed their languages. If you go through the item Italia in our site, treccani.it, you will find under the heading language samples of our words coming from Latin, from French, from Arab, from from Spanish, from other languages. We are not aware of that, but our own language, and therefore, let's say, the backbone of what we consider our cultural heritage, the Italian language, the vulgar that became Italian, is already a mixture of languages. Our arts, people coming from all over the world were influencing our architects. Say, Brunelleschi, when he built the dome of the cathedral in Florence, he was using the Gothic style in a Romanic sort of context. And his Gothic is not Gothic. It's something else. The same applies to Venice. The door, it was said, between East and West. But the door between East and West also intertwined styles. And this became the style of Venice, a new kind of styles. And the examples might be several. This is one of the main features of the Italian cultural heritage. The second one was this one of civic virtue. It was already illustrated, so I don't go back to it. What is important for me is to underline what happens when, let's say, the batteries are being charged to prepare the unification of the country, which is the time period that goes from the last decades of the 18th century to the first ones of the 19th century. At that point, an enormous role was played by culture in preparing and somehow affecting reality. Don't forget that at the beginning of the 19th century, still Leopardi thinks that there is nothing that can be done, that the Italians are lost, even though he invites the youth to take the lead somehow, because he thinks that the old generations have so many constraints that they won't change what should be changed. So there is a hope in that Leopardi demonstrates, and it's for the new generations. This is quite interesting, but this is the mood of the Italian intellectuals at the beginning of the 19th century. So preparing national unity when after Napoleon, one way or another, independence, freedom, the Vienna Congress was really decisive in moving something in the Italians. This was unacceptable to them, this going back to as it was before Napoleon. This was really unacceptable. So independence, freedom, unifying the country. And the role of culture was really remarkable by doing what? Well, first of all, by, this has to be admitted, by creating myths by using history. The creation of myths for the sake of national unity is a well-known exercise in false history. And we perfectly know that there are countries, the language of which was really invented. Countries in the history of which there are national heroes currently celebrated who never existed. I mean, myths are an essential tool for moving people toward an end. Italy did not need myths, but a use of its history that was somehow mythical took place, necessarily, I would say almost unavoidably. But here, this is where the civil virtue kind of leitmotif somehow enters into national myths, quite positively. And therefore you have civil economy, but you also have civil poetry. And you have civil music. And you have Nabucco, 1842. And you have Manzoni, and you have Berger, and you have Francesco De Santis, who writes a history of Italian literature that is a sort of contemporary history, because with the typical half-false interpretation of history that takes real facts and real authors, but they are interpreted as if they were living our own time. And this is what Francesco De Santis does. The same way as Cesare Balbo builds Italian history the same way. And the common thread is the fact that we have in common civic virtues, dignity that allow us to be free and independent. We are entitled to. We have no reason to depend on others, etc. This kind of, let's say, using history by covering part of it by myths has also something else that has to be noticed, is what Banti almost exclusively has in mind, the ethnic connotation of national identity. In the moment in which you are preparing a fight for independence, necessarily you are within the scheme we against others. And we is the Italians, the Italian race, the Italian blood. At this point, an essential element of our culture is somehow distorted and squeezed into a foreign notion, which is foreign to our tradition, but not to the scheme of national independence war. Manzoni, in his well-known Ode 1821, writes about an Italy that is united. I always forget the six, and now they are wet. Here, no, it was una d'arme, di lingua, d'altare, di memoria, di sangue, di cor. So Italy that is one in terms of army, language, religion, memories, blood, and heart, sentiments. Now this is almost entirely false, because if Italy was one in relation to one of these terms of reference, it was one of religion, because almost the wide majority of Italians were Catholic. But to say that it was one in terms of army forgets that there were 7 + 1 states in Italy, each of them with its own army. Sangue. This is where, nothing to object to Banti. This is the Italian stirpe, the Italian race, blood, jus sanguinis. We have the same blood, which is not true. We have several bloods. And this is part of our culture and of our life. But we have to take note of this, if you want, distortion of the sense of our national unity, and this virus that is a virus that, in my view, is part of any notion of any nation. But there might be antidotes that limit its erosion of better values. There might be lack of antidotes, in which case there is a sort of spreading around of this idea that ethnicity, blood, my race, is the protagonist of this kind of interaction. Now, what happens after we achieve unification? A unification that, I repeat, is largely due to this contribution of our culture in preparing the sense of what's going to happen. Well, Italy immediately appears much smaller and much uglier than the kind of heroic expectations that had prepared its arrival. There was another Italy, the Italy that had never been accomplished, that seemed to be more beautiful, but it proved to be impossible, or in any event, beyond reality. Our elite was what it was, Cavour, this is something that we already discussed in a previous seminar, the other part of the building at the Institute. Cavour had a grand design, but the elite that was called upon to implement his design was not equipped for it, simple like that. Because what Cavour had in mind was the modernization of a country that an industrial elite could accomplish, but the industrial elite did not even exist immediately after the formation of the Kingdom of Italy, and the weak industrial elite entered the scene by the end of the century, at that point compromising frequently and heavily with, let's say, conservative agricultural interests that pre-existed. And therefore, two things happen. We still have a contribution of our culture to somehow re-emphasize the noble and civil profiles of our new common destiny. And there were several contributions that go, let's say, from poetry, Carducci, typical example of civil poetry, Odi Barbare. You might dislike Carducci. I deeply dislike several poems written by him. But I understand that he who didn't like the Italy that we had, he who wrote everything is ugly, the stamps, the uniforms of the soldiers, everything is ugly, but he felt the need to demonstrate that, let's say, behind this ugliness, there was that Italy that we had expected to build and that was possible to build. And those heroic sentiments still had a sense. We have the contribution of our economists, such as Pantaleoni at the time, and it was mentioned already before. We have the contributions of legal scholars like Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, who gave that fragile and weak state the dignity that he drew from the Rechtsstaat that he learned studying Gerber, studying Labant, and then becoming close to Jelinek. This would be a chapter requiring an attention I can't give it now, because what Vittorio Emanuele Orlando has in mind is a sort of balance of power après the British model, but strangely enough, he has studied German, and therefore he has German authors in mind. And from authors such as Labant and Gerber, he somehow draws conclusions that go beyond the channel and don't remain in the continent. It's a very interesting thing. But he realizes really that there is an inner fragility in this Italy, where there is a monarch who is not entirely convinced that all the powers have been transferred throughout a constitution that, after all, is octroyé, is unilaterally given by him, and therefore unilaterally might be withdrawn. On the other side, there are local forces that don't entirely accept the reunification. And even in the parliament of the kingdom, you have pressure for the return of powers to local authorities. And therefore, in his mind, the Rechtsstaat means the state. What we have built that we don't see, another intangible, is the state, and the state is sovereign, not the parliament, not the king. None of the existing institutions embodied by human beings is sovereign. Sovereign is only the state, and all of the others are at the service of the state. His theory of elections is bizarre, we could say today, but is aiming at not infringing this principle that sovereign only the state can be. According to his theory of elections, electors don't give a mandate to the elected, to the representative. They are just making the choice of the most competent and the most equipped to exercise a public function. But it's a process of selection of the best servants of the sovereign state. So, I mean, this theory will fall down in the 20th century after the parties were created by Almighty God. At the time, it seemed to be a good idea, and it was actually a good idea. And when the vote was given to everybody and became universal at that point, it was a mandate. But it's interesting how one of our human sciences worked having in mind the strengthening of the institutional architecture that we had built and that was, as I said, so fragile. We had later on the most disturbing contribution that our culture has given throughout our history, what happened during the fascist regime. Because during the fascist regime, the notion of a nation that is open and built upon its diversities, a pluribus unum, cancelled the plures and wanted to be unum against the others. So the idea of an open nation, the idea that even in the 30s had remained, that our unity was unity of culture, not unity of blood, was abandoned. Our unity was of blood and of religion. And here there are the reasons why the master of Robert Merton was not so accepted after the war. Well, races were discovered, and several authors, not only one, wrote that not only the human race exists, but inside the human race, other subgroups exist, different from each other. And therefore the blacks are a race, the yellow are a race, the Jews are a race. And shame on us. These kind of things were still taught in Italian universities in the 50s. This really was something that should not have happened. And for sure, you don't expect human sciences to reach this point of, say, denial of reason and denial of dignity. I must say that sometimes you remain surprised because I didn't know this, I had never realized this at least before this year of celebrations and all the things that I have been reading due to the celebrations. One of them has been that when Italy decided to occupy Libya. Now, I mean, historically, you can go to the time of imperialism and find it as a sort of ordinary conduct, but it was not our case after all. We did not have an imperial destiny as others, and we could survive without it. Certainly, most Italians would survive without it. The Italians that Giovanni Pascoli had represented in his poems. And yet, when our grandfathers went to Libya, he wrote proudly, "L'Italia proletaria si è mossa." The, let's say, low-income Italy has eventually moved. It was true. They were sent to Libya. But this was not the sense of these words by Giovanni Pascoli. So this incredible kind of national pride that is exercised by aggressive conducts against the others, that necessarily is using the Italian blood against the blood of others. This has a terrible effect on the notion of nation and on the use of scientific resources, culture, principles, to the aim of reinforcing the sense of community under the same nation in Italy. Because after the war, the nation disappears. There are, let's say, to simplify things in political terms, say the culture somehow linked to the left and center left is quite wary of using nation, giving homeland a positive meaning, because the use of these notions that has been made up to their time is such that it's not for us. The right has a similar wariness also if the motivation is another one. Of course, they have to survive, and forgetting part of the past is helpful also for them. The main culture that plays a role after the war clearly is the Catholic one, due to the great men that the Christian Democrats brought into the Constitutional Assembly, La Pira, Dossetti, Aldo Moro, Fanfani, Taviani himself, and others, and they have the community in mind, but it's not the state. It's the family, it's the church, it's the intermediate community, as our Constitution says, as, let's say, groupings where the dignity of the individual person finds the appropriate context. So this is very positive for us, discovering the dignity of the individual, the dignity of the person, working for improving the life of people, having their health, their education, their welfare in mind. This improves several things, but our being a national community is somehow forgotten, and we are not called upon to identify ourselves as a national community. Despite this, there are so many progresses due to the new culture, and here you could see how many contributed, how many human sciences contributed to the well-being of these not clearly identified national community that, however, does exist. Think of the improvement of our social rights after World War II. Think of the health system that Italy has built, which is considered the second one in the world nowadays. Think of the mentally disturbed patients that one day, under the stimulus and pressure of just a doctor, a professor, and a cultural area, were freed of the prisons where they had been under custody, and how high in terms of civilization this kind of outcome was at the time, with all the problems that of course came out of this thing, because after that most of these people were abandoned and their families found themselves alone in taking care of them. But I mean, it was a problem that came afterward, and of course the solution was not the previous one. Think, if you want, of our industries, of the progresses that we had due to science, very frequently the chemical industry in Italy. Think of Europe, of European integration, and how Italian culture has contributed, not only for the sake of Italy, but for the sake of the other members of the European community first and Union second, to, let's say, go toward the ever closer integration that was written in the first treaty. So we have several contributions to this national unity that is still unnamed and that returns now, perhaps largely due to the celebrations of the national unity. Let's say the prophet of this operation was Carlo Azeglio Ciampi. because he was the first one finding the courage to test the enduring hostility toward the nation in returning to the national anthem and returning to the national symbols and suggesting to all of us that there was a positive meaning in this thing. And then, when we arrived at the celebrations, we already had his seeds that had entered the ground. An essential thing, I would say, going toward my conclusion, an essential operation, not necessarily and not only because we have somehow rescued the notion of nation in its original meaning, the notion of an open nation, the notion of a nation built on culture and not on blood, built on diversities and not on single races. Quite clearly, because those who have these ideas were against celebrating national unification, and this was very helpful. I said repeatedly that should we give an award for the contributions given to the celebrations, I would give one to them, because they were very useful in let's say, preaching their wrong ideas. But rescuing this notion also means something that requires us to go beyond now that the celebrations are almost over. We need going back to the civil sense of human sciences that we had at the beginning of the story. Because what is happening, as I was saying beginning this short talk, is that we have now the perception that despite the celebrations and what we have done around us, we are losing the intangibles of our common construction, that are the common values that are, let's say, trust and confidence, that are feeling that we have common aims inside our community. This would be a long speech. I don't have the time to do it, but you have to think about it, because what is happening now in our and in other societies that are marked by the events that have been occurring in the last 30 years, this tragic disentangling of the financial richness from real economy, this fact that there are people that are becoming so rich that these inequalities have become beyond credibility. This fact that we are still living in a world where the words of Margaret Thatcher of several years ago and somehow of Deng Xiaoping in the same years, society is what it is. Take care of yourself and run. Take care of yourself and run. Lady Thatcher said more Westernly, societies do not exist, only individuals do. Deng Xiaoping said, don't care, care of yourself and run as fast as you can, he was saying the same thing with other words. But this has been for years the sense of being part of a community, just not taking care of the others, just taking care of yourself. And those who did it successfully created such a distance from the others that no mutual trust is possible when the distances are so wide. Because we have nothing to do with each other at this point. And so, how can the basic structure of a democratic system survive upon these underpinnings? It's substantially impossible. So unless we fill the underground of our systems with those values that we have been losing, well, we are risking something. The Italians are happy because they are run by professors. But, I mean, they are all friends of mine. But there is something unhealthy in this thing. Deeply unhealthy. Happy Italy that has found this unhappy solution, because it's, though temporarily, a solution. But what will come afterwards? What may happen? What may happen in Greece? They too are run by professors. Professors in Frankfurt, professors in Brussels, professors around. So I don't want to be pessimistic in closing this speech, but certainly we need something that we have been losing, and we should ask, let's say, our human sciences to restore that sense of relationship, individual, society, etc., that was typical of our past sciences. Now, of course, I understand that Pantaleoni was much clearer than Adam Smith, but don't forget that also Adam Smith wrote that without a fundamental sense of justice, no market can properly work. So there are intangible underpinnings that have to be restored in our systems. Otherwise, the question that a Chinese official asked weeks ago to his Western counterparts during the meeting remains without an answer. And the question was, do you think that your democracies can cope with the issues that we are facing? This was the question of the Chinese. He was substantially sure that his country can, but despite Obama, he thinks that we cannot. I leave it here.